Okay, can everybody hear me okay without the microphone?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you a story. More specifically, I'm going to tell you the story of the fall of the Mongolian Empire. This is quite a violent story. It involves a lot of very dark and horrible events, so we're going to start with a humorous anecdote from another time in history, which will become important later, I promise. During the Napoleonic Wars, there is an infamous event in which there was a shipwreck in the English town of Hartlepool. Some of you may know this story. The only survivor of the shipwreck was a pet monkey that one of the crewmen had kept. Everybody else had died. Now, unfortunately, in the press of the day, the French were depicted by English cartoonists as monkeys. So the citizens of Hartlepool did the only logical thing. They had a trial for the monkey. The monkey was found guilty of being a French spy and executed. This is all anyone knows about Hartlepool. I promise the dead monkey's important. But let's get on to the meat of tonight's story. The time is the 13th century and the place is Europe. To be more specific, the place is Russia. There have been rumors of some strange new army coming out of the east that no one's heard of before. Emissaries from this army have come to greet the princes of Russia. They've asked the Russians to surrender to them. The Russians, not understanding that they're about to commit a horrendous violation of etiquette by the standards of these strange people, who they falsely call Tartars, have the emissaries executed. In response, this strange army invades Russia. The place is a battlefield. An army is assembled of knights, men in steel suits which protect them and have protected them for hundreds of years. These are the nobility, these are the upper class, these are people who have been trained to be warriors their entire lives, but they are not the majority of the army. The majority of the army are peasants, they are farmers. These are people who, as a rule, have never had to swing a sword or thrust a spear except perhaps to kill an animal. They have very little in the way of armor. They have almost nothing in the way of training. Indeed, the only regular troops with any real training are the archers, and their training primarily comes from hunting. They outnumber their foe, but their foe are trained soldiers. These are the people that we now know as the Mongols. They've come out of the east. They have conquered swathes of China, of India. They have an army which has been doing this for decades under the leadership of an individual known as the Wolf King, or to give it his Mongol name, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is actually dead at this time, but his legacy lives on. He has trained the officer class, if you will, of this army, in many cases personally. These soldiers were not promoted on blood, they were promoted on merit. So regardless of social standing, the best soldiers rose to the top. And then they were trained by one of the greatest military geniuses in human history. They were known sometimes as the Wolf Pack. The Wolf Pack of officers are leading an army which has lived on horseback for decades and has been doing very little except conquer everything in its path. The Russians outnumber them and expect an easy victory. This does not happen. The Mongols' bows are their preferred weapons. They're all on horseback. They're highly mobile. It doesn't matter how well protected you are in your plate mail. If you get within 20 feet of a man with a bow who can shoot very accurately, and all Mongol soldiers can, weak points in your armor can be exploited, and the sheer force of the impact can punch through plate mail on occasion. And 20 feet away is not close enough to kill a man with a sword. That's to say nothing of what happened to the infantry. The very, very poorly trained farmers are mown down by these professional soldiers, initially annihilated by wave upon wave upon wave of arrows. It's estimated that some Mongol bowmen may have been able to fire up to 6 arrows a minute. That's one arrow every 10 seconds, and that's an aimed shot. That isn't randomly firing into the air. That is picking a target and firing, the target preference being the center mass of the human body. And what of the semi-trained archers? Well, there the Mongols have a very interesting tactic. They have specially carved arrows that require an extraordinarily thin bowstring to fire. They will fire a hail of these, really without aiming too hard, into the archers of the enemy. Because of the thinness of the cut of the arrow, it's impossible for the enemy to return the arrow. However, a thin bowstring against the much wider arrow notchings of the Russians, that can be returned. So upon a volley from the Russian forces, the Mongols will simply ride back, remember they're all on horseback, and then ride through the Russian arrows, the far more numerous Russian arrows, grabbing them from the ground in handfuls, and then firing them back into the archers who initially provided them. It's a slaughter, and it's one that doesn't take terribly long. And then there's the aftermath. In their victory, the Mongols hold a celebratory dance at the coast of a nearby river, or the bank of a nearby river, sorry. At this, they dress the Russian princes who have come to lead the battle, that they expected to win, in the finery, the large coats and cloaks, which are their right due to their station. They then place the princes under the floorboards of the tent in which the dance is to take place. And they then have the entire army by stages drinking, laughing, telling stories of battle, and dancing the princes to death. This story was spread, and the result was understandably terror. Remember that the Russians don't know these people are called Mongols. They don't really know where they come from. They call them Tatars because it's something they've vaguely heard of. They don't really know what a Tatar is. They don't know what these people look like. They've never fought an army like this. They've never fought an army using these kinds of tactics. And the Russians are utterly overwhelmed. The Georgians are utterly overwhelmed. In a remarkably short order, the entire nation of Georgia becomes a vassal state to the Mongol Empire. Which brings us to the Hungarians. The Hungarians have a much larger army, and they are prepared. They gather their camp, as they normally do, very close together in the face of this army that's coming towards them. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the wolf pack has learned a new way to use the Chinese weapon of the catapult. Where the Chinese use it to hurl rocks into an enemy army, crushing them, or into the walls of an enemy city, knocking it down. The wolf pack have learned to put incendiaries, oil, gunpowder, smoke bombs into the catapult, finding it far more effective. And they use this to hurl fire, smoke, and foul-smelling ointments into the Hungarian camp, splitting up the army randomly in panic. The commanders of the army managed to rally, they managed to pull together, but they realized that they are surrounded by a seemingly endless Mongol force. What we now know is actually that the Mongol force was incredibly thin, that there was really no second line, but they were positioned on ground in such a way that it made it look as if there was. Psychological warfare being one of the key instruments of the Mongol conquests. Luckily, the commanders of the Hungarian army spy and escape. It appears the Mongols have not blocked off one road. It's the road that leads back to the capital. Taking this opportunity, they turn their army and retreat. They retreat in panic. It's the only way that they can do this. This isn't ordering your men into equal lines and marching them precisely in order to retreat. This is understanding that your men are going to flee and just trying to keep them all together and going the same way. The Mongols have two vast units of horsemen either side of this road, about a half a mile down. You can imagine what happens next. Coming to the next city, the Mongol army encounters a walled city. Now, the Mongols have encountered these before, but the Europeans had really taken this concept to an extent that the Chinese and the Indians never had. The walls were much larger, really designed to withstand catapult impacts. They were very used to siege warfare. And they expect siege warfare from the Mongols. The Mongols have a different attitude to that. They build their own wall. The Mongols surround the city and build a wall which encompasses it. They lock in an entire city of people and just wait. There's no need to fire into it. There's no need to send soldiers in. There's no need to risk any of that. Just wait. They can't send out foraging parties. They can't send out hunting parties. Trade can't get in. Relief forces are being mown down whenever they get nearby. They just wait, and they wait, and about 2 months later the city runs out of food and has no choice but to surrender. So that's capturing an entire city without a single catapult having been fired. Try to imagine what that's like, hearing that this is happening, if you live in Europe at this time. An army of people you've never heard of, using strategies and weapons and concepts that you've never heard of, invading you for reasons unknown, because the Mongols didn't explain themselves. They didn't feel the need to. They were out to quite literally conquer the earth. They didn't feel the need to explain that to anyone. So the Europeans immediately start spreading rumors and stories about what it is. What are we facing? An army of demons is very commonly the phrase used. The incendiaries, it's largely believed, were behind the claim that they had trained dragons with them. The dragons known to be something of the East. And they desperately cast about trying to find an answer. Why is this happening to us? What can we do to stop this? Because every army they send does not work. Every army is just destroyed. It's particularly humiliating that the worst casualties are among the knights, slowed by their armor, which was so effective for hundreds of years. The iron suit around the nobility of Europe being just torn apart by illiterate peasant archers you've never heard of. So, of course, it must be demons. No commoners couldn't possibly kill this many rich people, right? The explanations they come up with are desperate, but they sincerely believe them. The name Tartar is ascribed to these people, as I mentioned previously. Some scholars thought this sounded similar to the word Tarshish, which appears in the Bible, in reference to a ruler who will conquer the earth. It's also associated with the three kings who brought presents to the Christ child upon his birth. And that was very, very important, because German crusaders had recently returned with bones that they claimed to be the remains of the three kings. At about the same time, this mysterious demon army appeared out of the east. So it became obvious, they're here for the bones, they're here for their ancestors' bones. The bones are in Cologne. Obviously, that's where they're going. And so the plan was made. When the army inevitably reaches Cologne, we will turn over the bones and they'll leave us alone. Unfortunately, the army turned south, didn't continue on towards Cologne. So it couldn't be that. Okay, what on earth is going on? And the answer came to the medieval Christians, the answer which had come to them many times when trying to figure out who to blame. The Jews. They thought, well, there's this myth of a lost tribe of Jews who got lost during the escape from Babylon. Maybe this is them come to reap revenge for the way we've been treating the Jews for the last 1,200 years. Surprising moment of insight. And so they gathered together a synod of Jewish leaders at the city which was about to be attacked. And they gave them all the riches. Anti-Semitism had very much the same stereotypes back then as it does now, the love of gold and so on. So they gave them all these riches from the city, and they sent out the Synod of Jews to greet their brothers. I'd like to point out, the Jews were not consulted on this plan. The Mongols met with the Jews, accepted the offerings of gold, enslaved the Jews, and attacked the city. The word panic at this point does not sum up what was happening. If you ever want to understand what the apocalypse would feel like, I strongly recommend going back and reading some of the letters that various European princes were writing to each other at this time, because that's genuinely what they were trying to deal with. They were really trying to deal with the fact that the world itself might be ending, and what on earth do we do? And then one day, and I do mean one day, it stops. It just stops. For no apparent reason, no particular victory has happened. The armies are between conquests. Suddenly, across the entire European frontier, this army of demons stops, turns around, and leaves. Now, they leave soldiers in the areas they've captured. They don't abandon them. This is still Mongolian territory. The word Mongolian has now filtered through to the Europeans. And the Europeans don't dare anger them by trying to retake this territory. But they cannot help but be puzzled by what on earth has happened. It doesn't take long. It only takes a few years for the Pope to send an emissary to greet the Mongol king. It's important to remember what the Pope is at this time. He's the man who crowns the princes and kings of Europe. He's a very political figure. It's very different from the modern papacy. So, in a sense, the Pope was the de facto ruler of Europe as a continent. So him sending an emissary, please bear that in mind. That's how important this is. The emissary is exposed to the Mongol transport network, which is just men on horses. There's men on horses organized in such a way that there's always a fresh horse. So you ride a horse until it cannot be ridden anymore at top speed. There will be a man waiting with another horse, and so on and so on and so on. So you can cover incredible distances. It took me about 23 days to get from the Vatican to the heart of Mongolia, which for that time is an extraordinarily fast rate of travel. He arrives, and it's his job to understand what has happened, who are these people, and to give to their leader, known as the Khan, a message from the Pope of Europe. What he discovers is that Genghis Khan, the Wolf King, is dead, but that his third son, Ogedei Khan, is ruling. Where Genghis Khan had ruled from a mobile city, a horde that contained all his administrators and just rode around the entire empire, Ogedei has founded a city called Karakorum. It's newly built within the last few years, and it's unbelievably ostentatious. It's a status symbol of a city. It's not really meant to house farmers or trade or have any real practical purpose. It's just a symbol of power from where he's ruling. In it, he has had Chinese engineers devise a device to impress guests, which is an angel which, when a lever is pulled, will raise a trumpet to its lips, bellows will go off, sounding the blast from the trumpet, and in the center of the table, 4 taps will begin to dispense 4 different alcoholic beverages from the 4 corners of the empire. The emissary asks what's going on. Why have things stopped? Why have you stopped attacking us? The answer is simple. The king is dead. And they're not talking about Genghis Khan. They're talking about Ogedei. His son has died. And that's in some ways a more significant event. Because with the death of Ogedei Khan, no one knows who is in charge anymore. There's no clear succession. Ogedei had nominated one of his sons to succeed him, but Genghis Khan, as some of you may know, had a great many children, and those children had a great many children of their own. And they all, at this point, essentially had their own armies and their own ideas about who should really be running the Mongolian Empire. Then, the infighting began. What's interesting about the infighting is that it didn't take place in a conventional civil war. These aren't huge armies slamming into each other. It's actually a surprisingly bloodless conflict. It's more that no one's willing to send their army into Russia or Germany or wherever on the risk that that army will be diminished and thus lower their own political standing. So you have these huge military forces just sitting around essentially as poker chips in this conflict. I think it's very interesting to know who the players in this conflict are. Because it's not the Khan, or the Khan, or that Khan, or that Khan. Everyone is calling themselves Khan at this point. It's their mothers. It's their wives. Because when Karakorum was founded, it changed the nature of the empire. It made it more centered. And as such, the further you were from the center, the less immediate contact you had with power. Now, the men were out leading armies, but the women were not. So the women of Karakorum, the mothers and wives, and in some cases sisters, of the Khans, were the real rulers, in a very real sense, the real rulers of this empire. And they are vying with each other politically for control. Not to give themselves titles. Women cannot hold titles. That would be ridiculous. But to give titles to their sons and their husbands. The wife of Ogedei Khan, whose name is Torgen, has essentially become empress through scheming, alliances, possibly, but it's unconfirmed, murder of other women. When I said this was a surprisingly bloodless contest, I'd like to make it clear there's an exception to that rule. The armies were not fighting each other, but the losers of the contests were dying. To lose these political battles was not a matter of losing face or losing power. These women were literally putting their lives on the line, and not just a quick death, not a decapitation, as was the standard method of execution. These women were ritually humiliated and tortured to death by their opponents to deter others. I won't go into too many grisly details. I don't find that particularly tasteful, but I will tell you of two because I think it illustrates the general picture. One method, known to have been used by one of the key conspirators until Torgen defeated and killed her, was to have earth and rocks shoved into someone's mouth until they choked to death. Another woman who actually lost a fight to Torgen had every orifice in her body sewn shut so that her soul could not escape, was then wrapped in a rug and drowned. Now that confining of the soul was particularly abhorrent to the Mongols. Because if you have your head cut off, your soul can go and it can join the eternal sky and the spirits. And even dealing with his worst enemies, Genghis Khan, unbelievably ruthless though he was, had never confined the souls of his victims. So that tells you something about the fact it's not just that they're still violent, the degree of violence they're practicing has changed. This got personal fast. Peace begins to develop as Torgen maneuvers one of Ogedei's nephews into power. He becomes the new Khan. The other women, the women of the city, back away. They've not put their cards down, but they're not playing at the moment. Some sense of peace under the rule of Torgen. Again, a woman who holds no title. The emissary really arrives at this point in the story. He finds out about what's happened up until now. And so to the new Khan, he delivers his message from the Pope. The message is, read it, an incredibly patronizing description of Christianity, an explanation of who Jesus is, of what God is, and of why Khan should immediately bow to the Pope in Rome. The Khan was very confused by this for two reasons. One, his mother was a Christian, and so was his wife, so he didn't really need this explained to him. And two, he didn't understand how the Pope thought that he was the only person who God had chosen to speak for him. Hadn't God given the Mongols reign of the earth? When was their last major defeat? The only reason they weren't currently occupying the Vatican was because of infighting. Oh, and incidentally, the infighting has stopped. Just saying. Which is, a rough translation of what was replied. And the Khan begins to gather his armies, and it's Western Europe. That's the next target. And the Vatican is high on the list, because this has offended them to be talked down to like that. So they sent emissaries of their own back, keeping the papal emissary. They sent emissaries of their own back with a counter-offer. Instead of the Khan coming to the Vatican and bowing to the Pope to be crowned, officially, by the man responsible for God, Khan suggested that the Pope gather all the kings and princes of Europe together, that they all form a single caravan, that they come to Karakorum, and that they all bow before him and agree to become part of the Mongol Empire to, and I quote almost literally from the translation, save time. And the thing is, there's a pretty good chance that would have worked. Not that the kings would come, but that had that army swept into Western Europe, Europeans weren't adapting nearly fast enough to Mongolian strategy or weaponry. It's always really dangerous to play hypothetical history, but if I may indulge for a moment, I think really only the island nations would have had much of a chance. And that's primarily because the Mongols weren't particularly good at building navies. But something happens that saves Western Europe. Toragen dies. And we have no idea how. All of the writings at the time are incredibly ambiguous about what actually happened. There's only one real hint, which is a passage which states that she was sent to join her husband. The verb to be sent is significant in that it's not a common phrase, so it implies murder, but we don't know. That this woman died, but exact circumstances are unknown. What we do know is that her death led to a resumption of that same infighting that led to her rise to power. In fact, it was even nastier, even more brutal than before, and the armies did start fighting now. So another woman emerged, who you will have not heard of. Her name is Saragatani. Saragatani, that same papal emissary, had a fantastic quote about her. He said, "Had I seen another woman on this earth like her, I would have had no choice but to conclude that the race of women is truly the superior to the race of man." Which for the Middle Ages, let's bear in mind, that's a fairly significant statement, because in Western Europe at this time, women didn't have souls yet. Saragatani is unbelievably brutal. She really doesn't mess around with aligning herself with anyone. It's very much a join me or die approach. And she's very free in her use of torture, public humiliation, and assassination. When she has people assassinated, it's normally by a horrific method. So if she's going to kill you in private, it's going to be in a horrifying way that people hear about afterwards. And generally, she's going to kill you publicly, and it will take about 3 to 4 days. That's not an exaggeration. That's not being funny. She genuinely had people killed over a period of 3 or 4 days. Just imagine the kind of mind that can do that systematically. All 4 of her sons would be declared Khans. Names were Monk, Hulagu, Arik, and perhaps you've heard of one, Kubala Khan. These 4 Khans worked together rather than vying, by presenting a unified power block and with their mother in the background annihilating the support of the others. These 4 men grew to prominence in the empire. I want to backtrack a bit here. I think I'm just sort of showing this time as extremely violent and very conflicted and tortured. And it is, undeniably, a very violent time. But it's worth remembering that Mongolian society right now, in this 13th century, is nonetheless, in the aftermath of Genghis Khan's death, dealing with some of the most interesting social experiments the human race has ever seen. They're trying to be a meritocracy. That's new, pretty much. But they're also trying to experiment with things like religious freedom. This was very remarkable to the emissary and to other visitors to Mongolia. that they actively encouraged conflict between religions in a non-violent context. Now let's think about what that might have looked like. Well, there's an actual example. There was a public debate between the three main foreign religions: Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. All three very popular. Now, Genghis Khan had made it, and it was still a death penalty offense to commit an act of violence out of religious motivation. A Christian who killed a Muslim for that reason would be executed, and vice versa. Nonetheless, the Mongolians were people who loved context, who loved conflict of any kind, and so they wanted to see the religions fight it out, but they couldn't let them kill each other. So what they did was they arranged a wrestling match of words, literal translation, a debate, in other words. But it was organized along the lines of a traditional wrestling match, which meant that there were rounds with set topics, and between every round, there was a break. And in that break, traditionally, like wrestlers, there would be drinking amongst the contestants. Now, the thing about that is, if you're wrestling someone, how many rounds are you really going to be able to last? I mean, it's a physical contest. Someone's going to get tired. The thing is, these people weren't physically contesting. They were verbally contesting one another. They started at sunrise. The rounds lasted approximately half an hour, with a 15-minute break in the middle. This is roughly, they obviously weren't actually using a minute system, but this is an approximation. By midday, all three sides have gotten unbelievably drunk. It's worth noting that Mongolian Muslims did not follow the tenet of not consuming narcotics, so they were drunk as well. The Christians realized that they'd run out of arguments. They didn't expect this to last this long, and no winner had been declared. And so, in place of argument, they began singing hymns very, very loudly. In response, the Muslims began loudly reciting the Quran. In response, the Buddhists sat and silently meditated. That continued until about mid-afternoon, at which point the contest was declared a three-way draw on the grounds that all the competitors were too drunk to continue. Now, that's a funny story, and I love that story, especially because there's so many accounts of it. It's actually true. But what I think is really important is that couldn't have happened in China. That couldn't have happened in France. I mean, for goodness sake, the Catholics at this time were still killing any kind of subset of Christianity that started to form. This is before Luther and all that split. So any kind of subset of Christianity, any kind of subset of Catholicism itself, which, drifted too far from papal doctrine, was being wiped out. Islam, by far and away the most tolerant, maybe, of the religions in the Middle East at the time, was still very violent. And so here you have a society which, though it's torturing people to death, though it's trying to conquer the earth, is still really clinging to trying to be something new. It's trying to be something interesting. It's trying to be the next step of human development. And it's dedicated enough to that it's hosting this ridiculous display that ends up with the singing and the chanting and the meditating and the drinking. And that's just one example. But that's what Mongolia was. It was a giant experimental melting pot. They had something very close to the first ever postal service, which was a system of riders who would move messages between set points very, very quickly. They had this meritocracy. They had what was approaching a universal literacy program. I say approaching because it was only men who were being educated. This is a very misogynist society. At a time when few Christians can read the Bible, when more but not all Muslims can read the Quran, the Mongols Christians and the Mongols Muslims are actually more literate than their European, Middle Eastern, African cousins, because literacy is increasingly seen as a valuable skill. This society really does start to look, for a better term, terribly modern. Now, with the rise of Kublai Khan and his three brothers, they begin to advance again. They advance into the Middle East, Syria in particular, and then later into modern-day Iraq. The sacking of Baghdad sees the burning of the world's greatest library. The invasion of Syria sees the death of the assassins, or Hashashins, the group to whom the modern word assassin is now attributed. They were maybe the most powerful political force in the Middle East at the time, and the Mongols annihilated them. And then, just as it happened a few years earlier, one death changes everything. Their mother dies. The woman who's been holding the empire together at home dies, and with her 4 sons and their 4 separate armies on the 4 fronts of this empire, the empire will slowly begin to tear itself apart. The conquest will slow. There'll be occasional fits and starts, but it will never be the, for want of a better term, Mongol world wars that have preceded it. Really, the story from this point on becomes horrifyingly predictable. The brothers begin to feud. This feud passes down to their descendants. The Mongols spend an increasing amount of time fighting one another, as opposed to their supposed enemies. This gives the Europeans, the Chinese, the Indians time to adapt to this bizarre new force and to push back. And never again will the world shake at the mention of a Mongol empire, or a Mongol army. Now, I could end the story here, but I want to take a step to a slightly different direction, which is what can we actually learn from these events? What can we learn from the achievements of Genghis Khan, from what happened after his death? What can we learn from the dead monkey in Hartlepool? Seems to me the answer is actually quite simple. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to story.
So it comes down to?
Story. Stories. Narratives. The real achievement of Genghis Khan wasn't that he invented revolutionary military tactics. Plenty of people have done that. The real genius was that he saw an entire society, an entire civilization operating under one premise, and he changed that premise. He turned it into what was once disparate bands fighting each other. He took it, he fundamentally changed the story of what being a Mongol was, so that it made sense to form this vast horde and invade Europe. We can see this from another angle. Let's go back to those Christians looking at the onslaught of the demon army. Now, the idea of a demon army with trained attack dragons sounds silly to us. Remember, these people were utterly sincere in their fears. They were genuinely trying to make this bizarre event, which had no point of reference, fit into their story, into their personal narrative. They didn't try to change their narrative. They didn't try to change their worldview. They tried to make the outsider fit them. It failed, because of course it did. The people of Hartlepool, when they killed that monkey, were acting in a way that was perfectly reasonable according to their particular narrative. And what I mean by narrative, what I mean by the story of history, is the context in which these people saw themselves. We look back on them and we write new stories about them. But at the time, everyone in history, whenever anything has happened, has seen themselves as the hero, as the good guy, as part of the right group. They've seen a narrative intrinsic to their reality, which made their actions make sense. When they encountered things they did not understand, rather than altering their perspective, they tried to make that fit their perspective. And that's a pattern that goes through all of recorded history, all 7,000 years since we invented writing. Here's the problem with that. It makes perfect sense to do it. This isn't a bug in the feature of the human mind. This is a feature of how we think. This is just how we view the world, right? Quick example. Raise your hands. Who's here has ever been in love? If any guys here with a girl and didn't raise their hands, mate, I mean, sorry. All right, why don't you kind of the star of your own little romantic comedy for a bit then? That's just how we think. It's silly, of course it's silly, but that is how human beings see the world. And that's been a perfectly reasonable way to see the world, because if you lived in Hartlepool in the 19th century, you didn't know the story of the French or of anyone else. The only way you understood information was when people came to you and they gave you a story to contextualize your life and why all those people kept leaving Hartlepool and dying in some foreign country you couldn't pronounce. So that story had to be true because it had to justify who you were, where you were, why people were dying. And this has made perfect sense for all of human history. And then we hit the 20th century. We hit the 20th century and we have the advent of course, this happened in the 19th, but it was really popularized in the 20th century. We have the advent of photography, we have the advent following that of cinema, we have the advent of radio, television. So suddenly the world, people say, gets smaller. And we start to be exposed to other stories, we start to be exposed to other narratives, other ways of viewing the world. And the immediate reaction of almost every society is contempt for any other perspective. It takes us quite a long, alarmingly long time to adapt. Indeed, contempt is such a powerful motivator. It can be used to sculpt entirely new stories. Germany, 1939, perfect example of that. I think this is a problem, because the human mind is still functioning in a way that was developed by hunter-gatherers to impart basic information about events, that then was very successful all the way up until the 1800s at helping us understand the world, helping us understand who we were in the world. And then in the 20th century, it ran into too much data, it ran into too much information. You see, the Hartlepool thing only works if you've got a controlled source of narrative. It doesn't work if you're hearing a story from the French. And then we have the killer, which is the 21st century, which has completely destroyed this way of looking at the world. And it's not just 21st century, it's actually the last 5-10 years have completely altered this. And it's a small thing, literally and figuratively, that's completely changed the entire world. It's one of these. Smartphone. Now there's a comic and a social commentator called Dan Savage who says, civilization is going to have to get used to the fact that now all teenagers are carrying a small porn production studio in their pockets. He's right, but I think there's a bigger implication. I think civilization is going to have to get used to the fact that every person in the world, almost, is now walking around with a tiny news studio in their pockets. And you can see the impact of this happening in real time. We're losing the ability to really contextualize major conflicts. Look at Syria as a perfect example of this. There's too many people producing too much information from too many perspectives too quickly for us to really cope. Because we're still bound to this very simplistic but very effective narrative way of thinking. It's just not working for us anymore. Now, I'd like to illustrate this point with a very recent event I'm sure we'll all be familiar with. The events of September 11th, 2001. The attack in New York, we've all seen that footage, right? We've all seen those pictures. Has it ever occurred to you that couldn't happen today? Not the attack couldn't happen, but there'd only be one accepted camera shot. Imagine tomorrow, someone flies a plane into the Empire State Building. Just how much footage is there going to be? How many photographs are there going to be? How many people live streaming and blogging? Blah, 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 blah. Every person in the immediate area suddenly becomes their own separate narrator of the story. It's just too much. Our minds can't cope. And so we desperately try to make these things fit simple narratives. And we just can't. And this is a problem we're going to have to face up to. And we're going to have to face up to the fact that it's not a flaw, that we're not doing something wrong, that it's just that this is how our species works. And it's not something we're just being engaged with. And I wish This was the bit of the talk where I said, and here's my answer, here's the solution. I don't have one. The purpose of this is not to give you an answer to tell you what to do. The purpose of this is to ask you to engage with this fundamental aspect of how human beings think and try to find some way around it so that we can actually see the world as it is and perhaps engage with problems in a way that works. If we don't at least acknowledge narrative thinking as the incredibly important cornerstone of human thought that it is, then all we'll be left with is a memory of history, a memory of identity, a memory of purpose, and a memory of blood. That's the top. Right, it's late at night.
Before I get from my bus, I would like to get to you about the myth of mine about the Welshman who invented a better code of behaviour than Christian morality and lived his life following that code of behaviour, dutiful to his lying breath, the most useful of possible Welshmen. The Dragon on the Inn Hill, the Socrates of Tarpa. He exists between my ears as a fiction, but he might have the answer. But I've got definitely
I'll ask him if I have a meeting. Do we have any questions either about that last bit of the talk or about the history of it?
It's not really a question of what information or observation.
Yes?
Yeah. When you took an MBA course in the 80s,
Yes.
it told you the most expensive item in business is information.
Yes.
With Wikipedia, that's vanished, and access to the internet. Information is now the easiest thing to get on anything. And that's, I think, made a huge difference. I compare it to the six gun in the Wild West. It was called the equalizer.
Yes.
And we've had two equalizers in the last 20 years. One was the invention of personal PC. That meant you could take on government departments and exhaust them with letters at very little cost to yourself.
Yes.
You could copy and paste. Whereas before it involved laborious handwriting things and having a photocopier and expensive things. Now you're in a position to take on bureaucracy. I think that's made a huge difference to personal freedom. And likewise, this question of information. So we're now liberated in a sense, but perhaps over-liberated.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is if you have one person who controls all the information, that person has control of the story, of the narrative.
Yeah.
They get to dictate terms of essentially reality to people. What we're now living in, as you say, is a time when information is more ubiquitous and it's harder to control. So yes, I'd agree with your point.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else? We'll look back there. We'll get to you.
I'm just wondering, remember the time when Genghis Khan was actually on the throne and his son's on the throne? What would have been the knowledge of their conquests and what they were doing actually in Britain at that time? Were the British historians and courtiers and whatever aware of what's happening?
Very good question. The British probably know less than most of the Europeans. They would have heard of the Tartars, that's what they called the Mongols, incorrectly. They would have known there was an army coming out of the east. But really beyond that, they would have probably known more about the sensational aspects of the stories, the sensational aspects of the stories. So things like the attack dragons, the army of demons, these sorts of things filtered through Britain, but any actual substantive information about the tactics being used by this army and so on, that really is unlikely to have made it to Britain. It's mostly the Eastern Europeans who have accurate data. The Western Europeans as a whole pretty much just have scare stories, and the British more so than most, because they're slightly removed from Europe, both physically and culturally at this point.
Don't know if you can hear me. It seemed to me that was a marvellous example of a gripping narrative, yeah? And it sort of illustrated, it was so well told and gripping, how gripping it was. I mean, it draws one into the narrative and develops its own kind of momentum, and you were operating, as you told the story, a kind of selection principle. You see, we'll talk about this, and it develops that way, and then about that, and it was all following. And there's a kind of, because it was so well done, there was a kind of almost tidiness about it. Now, I know that was sort of intentional in a way, but it left one with a, because it was so focused on the narrative, it left a kind of blurry edge. I mean, like when, for instance, this competition, this wrestling bout took place, and somebody must have rung the bell, or somebody else must have said, "Look, get up in the morning and get them going at this time," or something. And there'd have been people around you, and perhaps just debates broke out amongst the people who were doing the bell, whatever, saying, "Well, I'm a bit of a Buddhist after all, I suppose." "Oh, no, you're not," and and this kind of thing, and there'd be a kind of messiness about it. Now, that messiness obviously can't be part of a simplifying narrative. And what I'm wondering is what goes on beyond narrative, and what goes on beyond this. Adam Smith again.
This is my talk.
Does it require a kind of a mobile telephone kind of sort of multi-source kind of thing, or many? Is it just like it is so complicated that and so multi-narratival that you can't have a narrative any longer? Does that happen, or does it perhaps only just require a self and another to have an interaction? Yeah, because if the interaction, in other words, I'm pitching for is kind of like depth rather than extent. You see what I mean? And if it's sufficient, if it's me and somebody who's come from Syria, and we're really trying to understand each other, then it takes just only the two of us to get an amazing conversation kind of going. And the amount of telephones and stuff around won't really be terribly relevant.
I'll try and encompass all that question, if at all possible. I think you picked up on, thank you, by the way, for doing this, the entire point of what I'm doing, which is that what I'm doing, it's storytelling, it's a narrative, it's condensed. Of course, I didn't mention who was judging that verbal wrestling match. Yeah. I didn't mention the behavior of the spectators. For reference, 3 judges, 1 Buddhist, 1 Christian, 1 Muslim. For the spectators, they tended to remain silent during the arguments and then generally would cheer or whatever at the end. Now, you're right that you have to cut off the rough edges and you have to cut off the complexities and the humanities. But my argument would be that's exactly what all of human history has been doing for a very long time. We know the story of Napoleon. We don't know the story of the third guy from the left in one of his formations. Now, what that means is that allows you to craft a story. That allows you to do exactly what I've been doing tonight, which is to turn real people and real events into a narrative, because narrative is what the human brain's very, very good at. And that's exactly the problem that these new ways of exchanging information gives us. You were talking there about a conversation between 2 people, you and a person from Syria, which is your example, and you'd be able to get a fantastic dialogue going. I'm not debating that. I'm actually saying that's almost part of the problem, is that you can relate to a person in Syria and another person in Syria and another person in Syria and so on and so forth. Human beings evolved in quite small groups, and our brains and our consciousness is very, very good at personal interaction. But we're not dealing with personal interaction. There's this phrase that the world is getting smaller. I think that's the exact opposite is true. The world's getting much, much bigger. If you think about the number of people your prehistoric ancestors would have known, in their lives would probably be less than 1,000. I walked by more than 1,000 people on my way here tonight. You see a war on the news, you can go online and you can read accounts and see video and see photographs taken by soldiers on both sides of that war. Depth is great for personal interaction, but because we're so attuned to achieve depth with individuals, that makes actually engaging with any issue of scale, when there is that potential for depth with multiple individuals, actually then dealing with an issue of scale becomes infinitely harder as a consequence of that, would be my argument. Does that sort of encompass?
Yeah, that's
fantastic. We'll finally get to you.
Right. That was spectacular. That was just hats off. That was brilliant. What you just did there.
Thank you, but do you have a question?
Yes, I do. No, I'm going to say your command over your material was superb. Your delivery was excellent, and the philosophically, you just ended on an absolute bullseye. My question really is this. Best guess, just straight out of nowhere, what would your response to it be? Like the narrative issue, the issue of narrative comprehension as something that collapses under the weight of information flow. Brilliant point. What do you reckon?
Honest answer right at the gate. Let it fall. I don't think we can come up with something now that will deal with this. I think it's going to get really messy. Now, whether that's physically, intellectually, I don't know. But this whole thing is going to collapse. It has to. This narrative thinking thing is just going to bottom out. It's something that's been holding up humanity as a whole, all cultures, all across the world, at all times, even independent of each other, for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, when it falls, and it will, I think we're starting to see it fall. I think things like the war in Syria are a really good example of this. And you're seeing it used, interestingly, as a weapon in that particular conflict. The perfect example of this is actually ISIS. ISIS get this. ISIS get this better than anyone right now. They understand the use of narrative as a weapon. Now, when it falls, and it will, something's going to emerge out of that. But I don't actually think we can come up with a solution until we see what does humanity look like without this. And then we see, well, where does humanity go now? Because we're too entrenched. I've thought about this a lot, obsessively, some might say, and I don't have an answer. I think we do need to see the in-between stage before we can figure out what stage 2 looks like. Whatever it is, it's going to be really interesting to look at that much. That's the best I got. Yes, I will say we are starting to run out of time, so the answers will be getting shorter. But I still encourage all questions.
Could you perhaps give us a few more words to describe what the culture, the lifestyle, and so on and so forth within that Mongolian empire was like, compared to what life was like on the European side?
Absolutely, and I will give you a short answer. It's not disrespect for the question, it's just that we do need to be able to get the bar stand for looking at it. Okay, here's a short version for you. At a military level, it's almost a pirate empire. So your soldiers are actually quite wealthy because they're looting kind of everything in their path as they conquer it. Within the Mongolian Empire, it's a meritocratic-based system, so promotion is based on merit, as opposed to aristocracy, which is the system in Europe and China at this time. That was one of Genghis Khan's introductions. That's partly why there's such an effective military and society generally. Once you actually get Karakorum being built, it goes from being this quite nomadic culture to actually starting to resemble a European aristocracy in some ways, where you have this big central city with these, 4 or 5 at the best major powerful houses run by these mothers and grandmothers. Fine power. It's quite similar to how one might imagine, for instance, Imperial Rome. If you think of that, where you have these generals who are out fighting, and then you have like Julius Caesar's mother, for instance, people like that. So it's quite comparable to society like that. For the peasant classes, for want of a better term, they're pretty much having the time of their life, because within recent memory, this was incredibly poor society, actually kind of on the verge of starving, and they now have this huge amount of foreign wealth and goods coming in. So it's very much peasants getting used to, if not riches, then comparative riches. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I know you haven't got much time.
I'm sorry, I would happily talk about that for about 5 hours, but I do think we need to get out of here. Is there any last really quick questions that I can answer in about a sentence, or are we good to go?
Can I just say the conversations needn't end. Stick around, have the conversations. It's just, we're going to have karaoke that's carrying on, and the place is going to be filled with a great atmosphere, great drinks, great bar staff. Thank you for the blind sweat. Thanks for your patience. Very sorry. Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Richard. And thank you all. Yeah, cheers. Thank you.